everybody, today on the channel I'm asking the question, is manual always better? And if so, how much are you willing to pay for it? Today I am driving a Ferrari 612 Scaglietti, or as it probably should be called, the Scaglietti. I don't know, I can't get the pronunciation right. Many of you pointed that out, sorry about that. Unlike Porsche, where I will deliberately pronounce it wrong, I do try and get some of these things right, but I gave up with Scaglietti. I'll get my friend Jack to teach me, give me some Italian lessons at some point. Anyway, this is a Ferrari 612, and I drove one of these only a couple of weeks ago. The car I drove previously was a slightly later HGTS car, which has a few upgrades designed to make it a little bit sportier, but that car also had the most popular transmission option, which was Ferrari's semi-automated manual F1 box. This car began life with the same gearbox in it, but as you can probably tell, now has a manual. This, it may surprise you to hear, was not particularly easy. I'm sure many of you have noticed that for the last few years, the prices of manual-equipped sports cars has been going up and up, particularly for the likes of Ferrari, Porsche and Lamborghini, where when they offered customers the choice, many in fact didn't go for it. This means that the cars are rather rare, and market forces have created a situation where the vehicles that once upon a time were cheaper now command a significant premium. In the case of some cars, like for example the 599, you could pay anything up to 3 or 4 times the price of an F1 car just to get your hands on one of these. Because of this, a lot of people naturally are trying to look at alternatives, and the nature of the old school F1 gearbox technology means that it's not impossible to convert a car from auto to manual. The reason for this is quite simple. In an F1 box car, you still actually have a manual gearbox. It's just that the selection of the gear and the clutch is now operated robotically. Converting these cars to manual, though, isn't a straightforward process. There are now several companies around the world who say that they can do it, and opinions seem to vary as to how successful they are. Each of the companies that now offer a manual conversion for a Ferrari will tell you that it's not particularly straightforward. I'm not here to judge the quality of those cars because I haven't experienced them. Instead, I'll be talking about this. And what's most interesting about today's car is that the majority of the work was actually done by its owner, Robin. I have been trying to organise this review for an awful long time, and I'm very glad that at long last we've managed it, because I'm actually really very impressed with this car. It's not 100% finished, but I'd say it's around the 97 to 98% mark. The bits that aren't actually finished are not gearbox related, but in fact engine. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. Before we get onto that though, let's quickly recap what the 612 Scaglietti is all about. This is to me the last in a long line of Ferrari front-engined V12 2+2s, a model line which has been around for basically as long as the company, and was in fact Enzo's preferred method of transport. Today we actually tend to associate the company with their mid-engine sports cars, but they are in fact one of the last model lines to come along. Robin has always been a Ferrari fan and had a 348 followed by a 360. However, as his family grew, he wanted to be able to continue enjoying his cars with them and did the obvious thing. He bought a 911. Try as he might though, he just couldn't gel with the car, so the hunt began for a 4-seater Ferrari. The FF was a consideration for him, but they were simply too much money, so the 612 was the natural choice. Where the 456 has a steel tubular chassis, this is all aluminium, a close relative of the later 599. The engine, however, is quite different. Where the 599 got a version of the Enzo's 6-litre V12, this instead has a 5.7-litre engine similar to what you'd find in the 575. It's a little bit more powerful here, making 540 horsepower from factory. The engine actually started life in the 456 and also made an appearance in the 550 as well. The later FF was offered only with a dual clutch gearbox from factory, but this came with either the F1 single clutch item or a manual. These also had only rear wheel drive, where the later cars had a very trick and slightly complicated all-wheel drive system. This is also the last car to have the more traditional coupe styling, and one of the most surprising pieces of feedback I got from the first video I did with the 612 was that many of you actually seem to quite like it. I'm not so sure how many will be keen on this particular car though, in the very striking colour combination of white, not actually its original colour, with a black roof. The white, it nearly pulls off. The black roof, I'm not so sold on. In any case, the 612 is a fine machine. Once upon a time you could pick one of these up for about 50,000 quid and in decent condition. Now they command quite a bit more, around 80 to 90,000 pounds for a regular F1 box car, but about 130 as what you'll need to fork out to get a manual. Robin knew from the off that the manual would be his preferred option, but even back in 2017 they were just a bit too much money. He tried for a long time to convince himself that the F1 gearbox he could live with, until he eventually realised he was simply kidding himself. So, being something of an engineer himself, he set about trying to make the swap work. If you want to perform a manual swap on a Ferrari, there are several hurdles you're going to face. Firstly, getting the parts, and that's a twofold issue. The first part is trying to work out what the parts are you actually need. Secondly, it's getting them. Luckily, 612 manuals are actually quite a bit more common than 599s, so it wasn't so difficult to source the part numbers. Unfortunately, many items required were simply unavailable. So what he did was set about working out where it was Ferrari got the pieces, because some parts were bespoke to the car, like for example the surround here for the transmission tunnel, but others were simply parts bin items. To give you an idea, the pedal box on this car actually has certain parts from a Lancia. Once he'd identified exactly what they were and the car that it was sourced from, he could then find the items he needed. In some cases he just used them directly, in other cases he reproduced them with modifications, and in others then used Ferrari parts bonded with others. So the clutch pedal here, part of it he made based on the Lancia design. The plate you actually put your foot on is just simply a Ferrari spare part, and the gear lever much the same. Most of the parts are genuine Ferrari. The really complicated bit of all of this though is not actually the mechanical side, because doing all of that stuff he did in 4 weeks in the evenings at home in his garage. I wouldn't say this is a DIY job, he does know what he's doing. The electronics actually turned out to be the far trickier part of the job. In other Ferraris, you've got an awful large number of systems that all need to interact with one another and be happy in order for the car to function. Particularly with stuff, say like the 430 Scuderia that has the F1 traction control, the e-diff system and various other things, you've got to make sure everything is absolutely right. The 612 is a little bit simpler, but even so, it's still a relatively complicated car. It took Robin some time to work out how to satisfy all of the requirements and make sure the car was happy. He, like me, doesn't want to drive a car that does sort of function, but has a million warning lights on it all the time. Eventually, he had a eureka moment, worked out what the problem was, fixed it, and hey presto, he had his manual 612. A lot of you will want to know the cost of doing a job like this, but the fact is, even if I told you, because he'd done so much of the work himself, it wouldn't actually be a very accurate figure. Most companies I know that offer this as a commercial service say they can do it for between £20,000 and £30,000. The fact is, that's as likely to be an underestimate as it is an overestimate. The other modifications I referred to earlier are fairly subtle. The engine has been remapped to accommodate for the fact that he's actually put in a new air filter and MAF sensor. Those are actually taken from the 599, which runs a much larger one than the original 612 item, which is taken from a 430. This means the car could be making a little bit more power than original. However, Robin has made no claims whatsoever for a precise figure there. The last alteration to this car of any significance is the fitment of a new Ferrari exhaust. The last car I drove, the HGTS, gets a sports exhaust from Ferrari as part of the upgrade kit, and I think sounds rather nice. I was expecting this to be a lot more raucous, but it actually isn't. It's quite nicely judged, and produces a sound that's very old school V12. If you're wondering why these earlier V12s, everything really up to the 599 GTB, sounds so different to the 599 GTO and onwards, it's all in the manifolds. The later cars run a very trick 6-into-1 system. However, the earlier cars run a system where they have 3 cylinders going into one, and then the exhaust all meets later down the line. That's why you get this more old school rasp out of the car rather than the high-pitched scream of the later ones. So that's a bit about the car. The million-dollar question then, has it all been worth it? You know something? I rather think it has. The 612 is actually a rather magnificent car that I was quite taken with, but it's pretty fair to say that the gearbox really was a weakness. By converting it to a manual, you've actually taken the worst part of the car and turned it into one of the best bits. This feels genuinely OEM. It's pretty much the same as in my 550, and rightly so, because many of the components are actually the same. The throw isn't quite as short as in, say, an S2000. You've got a real sense of weight. You feel like you're operating a pretty hefty gearbox, but then you are, so I've never really had any problems with that. Of course, the bit most people talk about is the noise it makes. Click, clack, it's absolutely fantastic. The clutch is also really rather nice to operate too. I've never quite understood how it was that Aston Martin got the clutches in their V12s quite so wrong. And this car really is proof of just how far off they are, because this is a car that didn't start life as a manual. It's been converted by a bloke in his garage, and yet the whole thing is super intuitive. The clutch pedal actually isn't too heavy, very nice to operate. You can sense the biting point with absolute precision. Really very nice to use. A highlight of these engines has always been how effective they are from next to no RPM, and here in the 612 it's absolutely no different. You only need really barely over idle and the thing will pull. Naturally, give it a few more RPM and it will fly. This is one of those cars where you don't really think it's especially fast. Then you look down there and you realise, oh yeah, it is, isn't it? And this gearbox really is brilliant. So slick, so nice to use. Heel and toe is an absolute joy. Pedal setup is perfect. There's quite a few rattles in this car, and it does smell a bit fuely because, like I said earlier, the engine mapping still a little bit of a work in progress. But the overall effect is of something rather capable. I swear it doesn't feel quite as pointy as the HGTS that I drove, and that probably makes some sense because that was designed as a sharper, more sports-orientated car. However, as a GT, this thing is absolutely sublime. Has more than enough punch to put a smile on your face. 4,000 to 5,000 RPM. What a thing. That. You just find yourself doing that. The F1 gearbox, to me, gets a lot of unfair stick. In the 430 Scuderia, for example, it's a highlight of the car. I wouldn't change it to a manual, I honestly wouldn't. But in some others, I can see why it gets the criticism that it does. And even in the HGTS, with the improved shift times, it wasn't superb. It did really let that car down. This, marvellous. Now, I can understand if you bought one of these, why you might still want to keep the F1 box. In auto mode, they're genuinely useless, but using the paddles can be a little less tiring than having to operate a clutch and a lever, and for some people, a clutch is simply something they cannot live with. So I'm glad that the F1 box exists. But if I owned a 599, where buying a manual, especially in right-hand drive, is next to impossible, this is definitely something I'd consider doing. With the F12, not that you can actually really do it, the car is so stupid fast, and the gearbox also pretty decent, this I think would feel like a little bit of a waste. But in the 599, I think this has worked very well. Much of what I can say about this car is not really dramatically different to the last one that I drove. The brakes here are very decent, also steels, they're not the optional carbon ceramics you got with the HGTC pack. Wow. You don't even need to really rev it out. But let's do it just in case. I don't think I'm channeling Jeremy Clarkson there. It's more Nicolas Cage, isn't it? You get into a rhythm with it. The gearbox is a huge part of that, and it makes it so interactive. You find yourself changing gears completely unnecessarily. The V12 has the power to pull any of 3 potential gears for every single corner, and yet you find yourself wanting to check which of the 3 actually is best because it's so nice. I'm not going any faster. Just having fun. And that ultimately is what a Ferrari should all be about. Despite having been mucked around with a lot, this car has actually proven very reliable. Robin's had it now for 5 years, and in that time, nothing's gone wrong. I still stand by much of what I said in the last video where the previous owner hadn't been so lucky. That really is the breadth of the Ferrari ownership experience, and you'll find other people out there that maybe had to spend a lot more money on their cars. In case you didn't watch that video, that car had about 17 grand spent on it in maintenance stuff over about 3 years. I've driven a lot of manual converted cars, nearly all ones where manual was a factory option. But this is the only one I think that I've experienced thus far that really does feel like it came that way from the factory. Today, in theory, I was supposed to be testing 2 different things. Is the manual better and is the HGTS pack better? I would say the HGTS pack does maybe improve the car because it still rode really nicely, but handled a little bit better. Obviously did improve the F1 box, but that's irrelevant here. The extra outlay to buy one of those new and now used is fairly small, so I would say they are the more desirable car and worth getting, particularly if you're a keen driver. If you simply want to have a V12 Ferrari, don't worry about it. This is still a brilliant thing. But is the manual swap worth doing? For me, in this car, yeah, it absolutely is. But be aware, to do it right, it's going to take some money, and more importantly, it's going to take some time. Plus, somebody that kind of knows what they're doing. If you want more details about what Robin does, I'll leave his link in the description down below. This isn't his business, he sort of helps people out really as an enthusiast more than anything else. But the world is a better place for people like him. Anyway, that I think is enough from me for today. I want to thank you all for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all for the next one. Bye-bye.